Good morning, everybody. Once again, I see the numbers clocking up. I know it takes a little while for each one to find their own point of connection, their own point of insertion into this work. So we will allow a few moments for those who are in the queue, in the series, filing into our digital waiting room to find their way. It's good to see that Marina Venica has found her way into the room. Good morning, Marina. But each one of you, wherever you are joining us from, whatever your time of morning, time of day, time of evening, whether this is the first time you are joining us or whether you have been with us from the start of this journey together, I welcome you today to the 9th installment of the London Society's seminar reading, Seminar 17, The Other Side of Psychoanalysis. Today's chapter, chapter 9, The Ferocious Ignorance of Yahweh, is probably the shortest chapter of this seminar in terms of pages. This might lure us into thinking that we can perhaps take a breather, given the pace of reading. The pace of the weekly seminar has certainly meant that we have to stay up to speed with the work of the seminar, given that life has not exactly been on hold on other fronts. So there's this whole series of questions and secondary references accumulating around our work on the seminar, various avenues for exploration branching off on all sides. We've also seen that there are no easy chapters in this seminar. And I would like to think that this particular chapter might be considered as, shall we say, just the tip of the iceberg. In some way, a hidden peak in the sequence of seminars, of sessions in this seminar. In one sense, it constitutes the culmination, the quilting point of the arguments that we have seen Lacan pursuing through the previous chapters of this middle section, entitled From Myth to Structure. Starting with the chapter on the castrated master, but more particularly with the exploration of the series addressing the Oedipus complex, totem and taboo, and now Moses and monotheism, which, if nothing else, will have given us plenty of secondary reading to pursue in terms of the references to the Freudian text. Here we see Lacan's exploration of the myth of the father in Freud, examination of the status of the father, the paternal function, as distributed between the three registers, symbolic, imaginary, real, and in particular as indexed on the question of castration. In this particular chapter, we will see Lacan seeking to prise open the relation, the distinction between prohibition and castration, opening up a new horizon for the psychoanalytic clinic. It's striking that the argument of this chapter will be pursued via the initial distinction between knowledge, knowing what we are doing, knowing what we are saying, and something that Lacan will describe as following a trace, catching the scent of something, without quite knowing what that something is, but pursued here in conversation with Dr. Caroz, something also played out in the relation between speaking and reading, or between the spoken and the written, a mode of speaking based on the reference to the letter of the text, the written trace, which I think is quite an appropriate reference for what we are doing here, speaking about the reading of a written text that is in itself reconstituted from the recorded traces of a spoken presentation that was based on Lacan's own written notes of what he himself had been reading in Freud. So when I say this chapter might be considered the tip of the iceberg, it's not just in terms of the platform on which it rests, but also, shall we say, because this chapter in the sequence of presentations in this seminar is pitched between the previous session, which was devoted to the reading of some of the questions and answers that make up Lacan's text Radiophonie, again, a written text that is the basis for a spoken broadcast, a text that in itself could form the basis for an entire year's work, but of which we do not yet have a published English translation, but contains some of the essential written references for some of the themes that are being pursued in the course of this seminar. Let's also not overlook the following chapter, chapter 10, the questions and answers on the steps of the Pantheon on account of the closure of the faculty due to a strike. This chapter would also repay close attention, even though it is not included in our particular trajectory in this seminar. Not because you can feel free to ignore that chapter, but primarily because in planning this chapter, 12 weeks somehow seemed to provide the right framework for the project. And so we found ourselves excluding the extra chapter, the +1, which is by no means surplus to requirements, but which constituted to some extent the awkward 13th term that disrupted our misguided quest for some kind of symmetry. Speaking of the 12 weeks of our journey, I will also take a moment to mention, without wanting to get too far ahead of ourselves, that after today's seminar, we have only 3 more episodes of our work together on this project. I've mentioned before the anomalies of the subjective experience of the passage of time as measured by our trajectory through this seminar, most of all during this period of enforced suspense, when some of the conditions, the external conditions of our existence might have been put into suspense. But as I'm sure each one of you will have experienced in your own way, the drive does not go to sleep, does not cease its pursuits just because some of the external dynamics of our existence are on hold. So even as we get closer to the end of this series of seminars, where it is still no clearer what kind of future we are in fact working towards, how this will all end, what kind of promised land we might be being led towards, all we know is that it is unlikely to involve dying of shame. All this merely to urge you to take your opportunity to pursue the reading of this seminar, to formulate your questions, maybe not even so much in the expectation of receiving the answers that we might have hoped for, but for each one of us to leave some kind of trace, some kind of subjective mark of this experience that we have undertaken together in relation to the reading of this work of Lacan. I'm very pleased to welcome as today's guide on our journey, Susana Huler, analyst member of the NLS and of the World Association of Psychoanalysis, a member of the London Society, but who has also lived in Argentina, in Israel, and in Spain, pursuing her singular relation to the analytic cause in various psychoanalytic communities and cultures. She is thus eminently well placed to bring us today the fruit of many years of clinical experience, many years of studying and teaching Lacan, in her approach to the theme of today's chapter entitled Yahweh's Ferocious Ignorance. Before I hand over to Susana, I will also just quickly take the chance to introduce today's discussant, Gil Caroz, who is a psychoanalyst in Brussels, who is also analyst member of the NLS, of the ECF, and the World Association of Psychoanalysis. He has occupied various responsible roles in each of these schools, including a period, if I'm not mistaken, as president both of the NLS and of the ECF. I thank him also for agreeing to act as discussant today, to intervene with some comments and questions in order to open up the conversation afterwards to the members of the panel and to the audience. I remind you that you are all able to participate in this discussion by making use of the chat function that you will find at the foot of your screen. In the course of the presentation itself, but also afterwards, contributing your own comments and your questions, which we will seek to take up as we can as part of the ensuing discussion together. But for now, let us hear what Susana has prepared to tell us about this intriguing chapter. Susana?
Thank you very much. I want to thank the Bureau of the London Society, Roger Litten, Peggy Papada, and Phil Dravers for organizing and leading this seminar that breaks the quarantine in a very good way, I would say, since makes us feel connected in our solitude of the lockdown. The way this seminar functions, in which each meeting has a different speaker, is extremely interesting and teaches a lot, since it gives us the possibility of witnessing the distance of the spoken word from the text, with different styles of the different people that speak. I find it very amusing and awakening. I will share with you the path that had in me an effect of truth, hoping that my talk will have in you this same effect of truth. Or, better to say, it will have more or less the same effect, since sexual relation does not exist. So, we are dealing with the 9th chapter, the ferocious ignorance of Yahweh. In this lesson, as Roger mentioned, part of the time, Mr. Caroz took the scene, invited by Lacan. He is working on comparative Semitic religions. His main topic in his talk was the historiographic critique of Ernst Céline's claim that Moses has been murdered as a martyr. Céline read the book of the prophet Hosea, which is the only one of the prophets that mentions Moses and his heroic lead of the Jewish people out of Egypt. The name Moses doesn't appear in the book, but nevertheless. Caroz claims that Céline's interpretation of the verses is wrong and is probably influenced in his readings by his Christian beliefs. Now, why do we talk about Céline? Because in the man, Moses, and monotheism, Freud quotes his investigation, Céline's investigation about the murder of Moses. Now, Lacan's question is, why did Freud need to state that Moses was murdered? Freud connected the history of the Jews with a hidden feeling of guilt due to the murder of the original father, the Urvater. Freud was looking for an answer to a burning question. What can explain the suffering of these people and the amazing fact that they still want, or they are compelled to, or are under the Zwang, the compulsion, to be Jewish, and they persist as a people? He considers the Christian religion as the one that solves the problem of this unconscious feeling of guilt through redemption and identification with the prophet that is killed and becomes the Son of God. Freud, while writing this last book on a great man, Moses, was a witness to the ascension of the National Socialism, and he could, by sure, hear the voice and the low German language of Hitler in the radio. One of the unpronounced questions in the book could have been, why Hitler? How did he become a leader, being so bluntly the very opposite of a great man? Now, Freud begins his book with a kind of apology for stating that Moses was not a Jew, but an Egyptian. He says, depriving a people from a man that this people celebrates as the greatest of its sons is not something that he will do happily or carelessly, more so being himself a Jew. But truth, Freud says, is above national interests. Now, today, since Lacan's 16th and 17th seminar, we are not so sure about the power of truth, and we are aware of the impossibility of a truth about the real. In 1956, said Lacan, Seminar 3, the chapter 17, in English, page 214, that in writing Moses and monotheism, Freud makes you feel that analysis is absolutely inseparable from a fundamental question about the way truth enters into the life of man. The dimension of truth is mysterious, inexplicable, since man accommodates himself to non-truth perfectly well. According to Lacan, this is the question that is troubling Freud to the end in this book, in Moses and Monotheism. Freud's answer to this question, and according to Lacan's reading, is that truth is mediated by the ultimate meaning of the idea of the Father. The Father belongs to a reality that is sacred in itself, more spiritual than any other, since nothing in lived reality points to its function, his presence, his dominance. How does the truth of the Father, how does this truth that Freud himself calls spiritual, Freud called it Geistigkeit, how does this truth come to be placed in the foreground? The thing is thinkable only by means of this ahistorical drama inscribed in the very flesh of man at the origin of all history, meaning the death, the murder of the Father, a very mysterious myth, impossible to avoid in the coherence of Freud's thought. Moreover, Lacan reads in this book a mi fine, me funai, but Peggy Papada told me that I have to say mi fine, of the old Freud, meaning would have been better not to have been born, which Lacan quotes from Oedipus in Cologne. And we can find also this kind of thought in sacred texts like the Ecclesiastes and the Gemara. In the Gemara, it was a topic for an important discussion between two different schools of thought, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. The outcome of that discussion in the Talmud was, it is better for man not to have been created. But since he has been created, he should examine or to rummage his actions. As to Lacan's question, why did Freud need to state the murder of Moses? I found very clear Miller's development in 2003 in the last lessons of seminar Un effort de poésie, where he says that for Freud, the compulsive character of thinking and believing in religion can't be based only in communication, because that is only communicated from mouth to mouth is under the logical thinking. It would not have the character of a Zwang, of a compulsion. An imposed thought in the modality of the necessary, as it is the religious belief, has to have been repressed, has to have been introduced in the unconscious, and only in this way can a tradition come back from repression and constrain the host in its spell or its curse. For Miller, this is the secret of Freud's invention of the murder of Moses, the Egyptian, that brought monotheism from outside, from Egypt. The S1 as XVII, coming from outside. Freud applies the clinic of trauma on the crowd, on a community. And in this clinic of trauma, the ideas and events of the time of the trauma have been forgotten and repressed. Only after generations, thinks Freud, Moses' truth comes back. And then we have two Moses. I never was told that in the kindergarten. The fact that the master signifier has been forgotten makes it irreducible, indestructible, and can't be tamed by logic. From this, Miller proposes that Lacan answered to this book of Freud with his invention of the discourse of the master. Since Freud's book teaches that only when repressed, the master signifier has immense power. More fundamentally, Miller says, the book is a question about the drive. That is, about what the drive has as deranged, unhinged. I think it was a terrible and urgent question to be asked when Germany was leading a terrible war against culture. About our chapter, a question I had was, why is this the name of the chapter? What makes it the best summary of the chapter, Yahweh's ferocious ignorance? Lacan learned about this ferocious ignorance of Yahweh in the book of the prophet Oseas. In this book, Lacan reads, I understand, the imposition of monotheism of the discourse of the master, beating the myths. A book that witnesses the clash between paganism and monotheism in which Lacan learns history. Now, which ignorance is Yahweh's ignorance? And why is it absolutely necessary for Yahweh to be ferocious in his ignorance? Seems to be that Yahweh didn't have to have many reasons to be ferocious. He was ferocious. We have an answer in the lesson itself, in page 135, where Lacan says, to be a father, not only a real father, but a father of the real, there are things that one must ferociously ignore. One would have to ignore everything that is not of the level of structure, this level to be defined as the order of the effects of language. This is where one falls upon truth. And then he says the opposite, or from truth. Yahweh is ferociously ignorant of everything that exists of certain religious practices that were rife at that time and that are founded on a certain type of knowledge, sexual knowledge. Now, about this knowledge, does Lacan mean by this the knowledge as a means of jouissance that we learned about in chapter 3? I think it is not. I rely here in a very clarifying assertion of Miller's in the lesson of 28th of January 1998 in the seminar Partner Symptom, in which he says, knowledge as a means of jouissance, as a phrase, is a translation of the 7th chapter of the Traumdeutung. There, in this text of 1898, we learn from Freud that in a state of desire, the acquired knowledge in a previous experience of satisfaction with the object produces an hallucinatory satisfaction which does not stem from the obtention of the object of necessity. And this justifies, said Miller, a psychic apparatus to be at stake, meaning that desire and his hallucinatory realization leaves a trace, a mark, and the subject is more interested in the pleasure that gives him the trace than that from the real object. So we have here, therefore, in Freud, the connection between signifier and satisfaction. This apparatus exists under the power of the discourse of the master that comes to life with monotheism. This is not the same knowledge, or maybe the savoir-faire, that Lacan connects to paganism. Now, what does it mean that God ignores what exists? In Je parle au mur in Sainte-Anne, in 1971, Lacan says that ignorance is not a low value. It's not a deficit either. It is linked with knowledge, is a way of establishing knowledge, to make it established knowledge. That is why he could say that Oedipus became a master, but by having erased the question of truth when he solved the riddle posed by the Sphinx. Established knowledge is the opposite of truth, of the effect of truth. It does not search for an effect of truth. Now, no doubt that the God that was one wanted precisely to consolidate the knowledge in a set of laws as a father of the real. Lacan attributes sexual knowledge to the practices of prostitution. This would be a mythical knowledge that would regulate the life of men. We know there were prostitutes in the temples, like sacred prostitutes in the temples, and their practice was part of the cult and the rite in the relation with the pagan god Baal and his wife. Sexual knowledge in the circumstances of the visit to the temple would be, no doubt, a savoir-faire and a mixture of different kinds of jouissances. The sexual one and the one that originates in a certain knowledge of what God is and what he expects from you in order to return to you his favors. Lacan puts very clearly, though, that this knowledge would not, in any case, say what the sexual relation is. Now, prostitution was not forbidden in the Jewish religion, but it was absolutely forbidden to mix prostitution with the worship of God and with the family life. Freud would say in Moses and Monotheism that God from monotheism would be completely separate from sexuality and exalted as an ideal of ethical perfection. Meaning that this belief, this worship of God, entailed a drive resignation, according to Freud, connected with laws about mating, as well as the resignation to see an image of God and to pronounce his name. The people had got a name, Israel, but their God will be what he will be, or I am what I am, Ehyeh asher ehyeh. In the lesson of 11 of March, in Oedipus, Moses, and the Father of the Earth, that we learned with Alexander, Lacan said that one thing is certain: all relations with women are znunim, prostitution. Lacan tells us that he had read Hosea, and he says, God addresses Hosea because his people have prostituted themselves definitively. Prostitution covers everything that surrounds him, the entire context. Whereas what the master discourse uncovers is that there is no sexual relation. Our chosen people found themselves in a bit of a pickle where things were very probably different, where there were sexual relations. This is probably what Yahweh calls prostitution, said Lacan. Now, he reads prostitution as the mythical knowledge that regulated life. In this book, Lacan finds the history of the struggle between monotheism and the knowledge embedded in myths. Well, because of the comments of Lacan on Hoseas, I read the book of the prophet too. And I was astonished, baffled by his first verses. Then I understood why they didn't teach us the book in the school. God orders Hoseas to take a prostituted woman as his wife and make with her prostituted children. At this stage of my preparation of this talk of today, I had to call Jerusalem to a great rabbi, since Lacan says that every rabbi is great. This one is really great, and describe my astonishment to him. Now, in other occasions, I would have from him an answer on the spot, in which the rabbi would say and claim different things. This question, this time, seems to have been a tough one. Therefore, he said, I shall call you back. He called me back and brought for me an answer from the Midrash, meaning the Talmud from Babylon, Masechet Psachim, and said as follows. According to the Midrash, which Lacan described in Radiophony as a way of taking distance from the written by the spoken word, according to the Midrash, God approached Hoseas and ordered him to go to the people and admonish them bitterly for their bad behavior. And God showed his great anger. Hoseas replied, "O God, you are the master of the world. If the Jews behave so badly, you can go to another people on earth and make them your children. It was quite chutzpah, this answer, this proportion of Oseas. God understood at this stage that Oseas was not up to the job of a prophet and told him to have prostituted children with a prostitute, and when he will be asked by God to give away one of the children, he will say, I cannot, he is my child. When all this happens, and Oseas had 3 children, he became fit to be the prophet Oseas that spoke in the name of God. This midrash sounds quite far from the text, but through the name of Oseas' children, God was tithing very strongly the prophet's family with his commands and his teachings. This midrash solves perplexity facing those verses by adding meaning that pleases the belief of having been chosen, a very biased answer. Lacan once asked, why is monotheism an advantage in humans' life, supposing it is an advantage? Towards the end of Seminar 3, the seminar on psychosis, it produces an answer. It has to do, the answer, with the innumerable fears that are present in human life. And I quote, to have replaced these innumerable fears by the fear of a unique being who has no other means of manifesting his power than through what is feared behind these innumerable fears, is quite strong, quite an accomplishment. Difficult sentence. This is in capital in chapter 21 in June. Now, reading this chapter, these chapters, not only this one, and following our discussion in this seminar, I felt it would be helpful for me in my search of the effect of truth that pulls me out from the established knowledge to follow my questions and astonishments. I wanted to have a short vademecum of Lacan's statements about sexual relation and prohibition and the myth of Oedipus and his destiny. I also thought that it's easier to understand what does it mean that there is no sexual relation, reading what Lacan says precisely about when there is sexual relation. At this moment, I had to call Tel Aviv, and I had the help of a friend to recall the different places in Lacan's teaching where to find what I remembered. I thank Nehama Gesser for her help and her enthusiastic engagement in our conversations. So, first step in the vademecum. It comes from the following year, Seminar 18, in the chapter 6. Lacan says, what we consider is essential about the sexual jouissance. Sexual jouissance can't be written. Man, qua man, as long as he functions, is castrated. The woman, if she exists, has nothing to do with the letter. Now, it is because of this reason that she does not exist. Considered as the woman, she has nothing to do with the law. So, how do we have to understand what happened? Asked Lacan. People make love, isn't it so? We perceive what causes the problem when we take interest in it, precisely, when we try to structure make the sexual relation function through symbols, what stands then as an obstacle? The fact that jouissance gets involved. And then he asks, is the sexual jouissance treatable directly? It is not. Now, we know somebody that ended in jail convinced that jouissance is treatable directly, and his name was Wilhelm Reich. Well, is it jouissance treatable directly? It is not. And that is why speech exists. Discourse begins because there is a gap. We could also say that the gap is produced because discourse begins. Again, one thing and the opposite. The truth is that discourse is implied in the gap. The symbolization of sexual jouissance borrows all his symbolism from jouissance that is prohibited for some confused things, said Lacan. We can articulate it with the pleasure principle, and this has only one meaning: not too much jouissance, since all the jouissances end in suffer. It becomes therefore clear that in order to be structured, the sexual jouissance found his reference in prohibition, as named, of jouissance. So prohibition, so the sexual jouissance can be structured. The sexual jouissance only gets its structure from prohibition that falls on the jouissance directed to the own body, in the edge of the mortal jouissance. It only achieves the sexual dimension, directing the prohibition on the body from which comes the own body, that is, upon the mother's body. Only the law can bring to discourse what has to do with sexual jouissance. Now, in 1971, in December the 2nd, in Sainte-Anne, in what is called Je parle au mur, Lacan said, there is no sexual relation for the beings that speak. Why? I like it very much that he asks and he answers. Because their speech, the speech of the being that speak, the way it functions depends. It is conditioned as speech by this, that this sexual relation is a speech forbidden to function in a way that permits to account for it. Rendre compte. I do not say that speech exists because there is no sexual relation. That would be absolutely absurd, said Lacan. I do not say either that there is not sexual relation because speech is there. But the being speaks, and it is but from speech that proceeds jouissance, that which is called sexual, to be differentiated from sexual relation, sexual proportion. Only sexual jouissance determines what has to be obtained, namely the coupling. Speech creates the make-believe, the semblance of woman and man, meaning that woman and man are semblance and not reals. In my view, I have to say all this means that substitution of prohibition by impossibility is not complete. When Lacan reinterprets the prohibition of desire as the impossible of jouissance, the loss of jouissance in repetition is still spoken as prohibition, stemming from obscure places. obscure is important word, in my opinion. And now, the 17th of February, 1976, in the Santon, he said, to the extent that there is a Santon, there is no sexual equivalence. That is to say, there is relation. Indeed, meaning that in psychosis there is relation. Indeed, if non-relation stems from equivalence, then relation is structured to the extent that there is no equivalence. I didn't read it properly. Indeed, if non-relation stems from equivalence, then relation is structured to the extent that there is no equivalence. Therefore, there is both sexual relation and no relation. Where there is relation, it is to the extent that there is symptom. That is to say, to the extent that the other sex is supported by the symptom. I, said Lacan, allowed myself to say that the symptom is very precisely the sex to which I don't belong, that is, a woman. If a woman is a symptom for any man, it's quite clear that another name needs to be found for what's involved in man for a woman, since the symptom is characterized precisely by non-equivalence. This is the only thing, the only nook in which what is known as sexual relation in the parletre, in the human beings, finds a support. That was in Saint-Thome. Now, in L'Insu qui sait de l'ambiguïté et l'amour, the 15th of March 77, he said, I don't recognize all the women. Because if there was sexual relation, we have to think sexual proportion, every man would recognize and mate with every woman, which is not the case. I don't recognize all the women. Sexual relation there is not, except incestuous. That is exactly what Freud said Lacan. There is not except incestuous or murderers. The myth of Oedipus appoints that the only person with whom you want to sleep is the mother, and the father you kill. The more so if you don't want that they are your mother and your father. In Le Moment de Conclure, 11 of April 1978, he said, I announced that there is not sexual relation. It is the basis of the psychoanalysis. There is no sexual relation except for the neighboring generations. That is, the parents from one side, the children from the other. It is what the prohibition of incest faces. Knowledge is always linked with la asexualité. There is no sexual relation but thoughts, and this is, I think, very important for our discussion. There is no sexual relation but thoughts orient themselves. They crystallize on what Freud has called imprudently the Oedipal complex. The tragedy gave him in this form a myth, something that states that it is not possible to prevent a son from killing his father. So here I would like to stress that thoughts orient themselves. You can't think without an orientation. Sexuality is unthinkable without an orientation. When Lacan says that the Oedipal complex is a dream of Freud's, we have to remember that a dream, what I said the last week, that a dream has a navel which connects it to what can't be said or thought. Means, this dream of Freud's has a connection to the real, and the law that prohibits incest is a real, I think, being the basic law of human society. Lacan says that it is not that the Oedipal complex has nothing to do with what we do in analysis. But we learned that it became a serious obstacle. We learned that, helped by Lacan, of course. It became a serious obstacle when it became a myth that would regulate analytical work, or even worse, it would regulate the life of the analysants. This dream of Freud's became established knowledge that obstructs the way of the truth that appears in any analysis if you are able to listen. When you are stuck with the established knowledge, you can't listen. I think that I understood better what Lacan meant in his critiques of the complex, reading the case of the flight talks, which is a case that has been published in Brussels. A case that he mentions in different occasions, in Seminar 4, Seminar 6, and in the direction of the cure. We see there, in Lacan's description of Roth-Lebovitzy's description of the case, we see there that the analyst pushes her patient to acknowledge his Oedipal desires. And as a response to this real presence, I put it in brackets, of the analyst, he concludes that in order to be cured, he has to sleep with the analyst. That's what the analysant concluded. After this logical conclusion, the analysant takes action and enjoys, finds his truth, not the analyst's truth, in what is called a transitory perversion, during which repetitions he feels for the first time that he is really alive. Well, for the end of for this part of our seminar, before our discussion, I will say that many years before all this, far before the Second War, but when fascism had already begun to show his claws, in 1920, Freud stated in his essay, Psychology of the Crowd and Analysis of the Ego, that, and I quote, "The sexual drives restricted from their goals give way to enduring connections due to the lack of total satisfaction. These are the links in a crowd. The question Freud poses is on the relation of the direct sexual drives to the collective formation. Two people reunited in order to obtain sexual satisfaction become, because of the desire of loneliness, a living argument against the gregarious instinct and the collective feelings. The influence of the crowd, from the other side, exteriorizes as shame, and jealousy protects the election of the sexual object from a collective tie. In the orgy, from the other hand, love and real election disappears, and all the objects have the same value." I wondered if this is what meant Lacan when he talked about the fact that the Jews were having sexual relations. Freud again. Amorousness appeared quite late in the relations among men and women. Therefore, was also late the development of the opposition between sexual love and collective tie. I find this very important. And to the end, the love for the woman breaks the collective links of race, nationality, and social class, and in these ways achieves an extremely important civilization work. Thank you.
Susana, it is we who must thank you. I find myself, let's say, just about at a loss for words to formulate my appreciation for the way you have taken us through the ploughing of this field and rendering it fertile for us. Not in any way, shall we say, in terms of adding to our knowledge, but rather more and far more importantly, by putting in question everything we think we might have known on these questions, which, shall we say, seems to me a far more productive and provocative use of knowledge, in the sense of using knowledge to produce questions, even the questions we don't know how to formulate, let alone how to answer. But as you yourself said, when you set out, in order to produce effects of truth, and maybe it's the effects of truth that have the capacity of transmitting something beyond the question of a communication of a knowledge, something you formulated very clearly for yourself as you set out. Now, I'm not going to ask I'm going to restrain myself from asking the questions because I know Gil has some comments prepared, but I can't help just commenting on how striking I found the most minimal formulation that you brought into focus for me, putting into parallel the rise of monotheism and the rise of the master discourse. It's not something that ever registered for me. And the consequences of simply running those two questions alongside each other, for me, are profound in terms of tracing out the consequences. In what way would the rise of monotheism amount to the establishment of the master's discourse? And that would, in terms of the political consequences, that would allow us to pursue the other brief articulation that you made right at the start of your talk, where in contrast to the question, why Moses, you posed the question, why Hitler? And for me, that's so powerful, because in contrast to the question, why Moses, why the great man, why the great leader, instead we see the flip side of the question, how is it that these particular characters, the very opposite of a great man or a great leader, can come into the position where they have the dominant effect in our cultural times? And we don't need to look very far for examples in our times. So there's plenty for us to discuss and plenty for us to follow through this using the framework of what you've elaborated for us. But first, I'm pleased to be able to ask Gil to make some comments and raise some questions for us to discuss together. Gil?
Yes, thank you, Roger. I also had this impression that many of the points you bring. Sorry.
Très bien. Trouvez ceci sur le web.
Digital connectivity, you can't switch it off.
Yeah. I also had this impression that you ask questions which are provocative and force us to get out of our habits. Some formula that we repeat again and again I put the question here, and then this is very interesting. I want to also to thank you, Susana, for this exploit of a commentary of a chapter that is not a whole speech of Lacan, but that is in itself Lacan's commentary of the paper of André Charcot. Cacot, pardon, sorry, Cacot, not Charcot. Whom he invited to be put in the picture, Mio Parfum. I don't know how to translate it, Mio Parfum.
Gil, could I ask you to put, Susana, could I ask you to mute your microphone, because I think we might getting feedback from Gil coming through your microphone, and that's making it a bit difficult to follow. That's the only thing I can. Gil, can you just rephrase that last bit, which was difficult to hear?
What I said, it's the, yes, it's, Lacan says that he invited Cacot in order to be mis au parfum of a knowledge about exegesis. Alors, mis au parfum, I don't know how to translate it. I translated it, put into the picture, or...
Yeah, or maybe catching the scent.
Something about
is that the phrase?
Yes, about the exegesis of the Bible, the one that is not allegoric, but go through a kind of a work on the letter. By the way, the example that was given to you by the rabbi is not this kind of interpretation. I think it's we can see that in the Midrash there's many. It's not the only way to interpret. The little story of Hosea challenging God and God's reaction. It's I think clearly an allegorical interpretation, and not a work of not a kind of work on the letter. I think you give us a very good key to read all the chapter in the commentary that you made about the title. We are used to think of the God of Abraham as a ferocious one, the one who is always angry on his chosen people, cruelly punishing him, etc. We distinguish this God, the God of Abraham, from the Christian God of the universal love, and also from the God of philosopher who guarantee the reassuring of knowledge of science. But reading carefully the title, we see that here the ferocity of the God of Abraham is not exactly that one. It's not the fact that it is punishing his people all the time, even though it makes part of it, but it's first of all a ferocity of his ignorance. So you explain very well the ignorance that is at stake. It is not a low level of knowledge, but rather not wanting to know anything about sexual knowledge. It's, in a way, the strength of this ferocity is the strength of censorship, I think, in terms of the second topic of Freud. So it's the strength of the censorship that allows repression. Moreover, if it's a not wanting to know anything about sexual knowledge, it's also the condition of the existence of an established knowledge. Sexual knowledge has to be repressed because it disturbs established knowledge. It's also interesting that you situate this ferocity, as Roger said, of the monotheistic God as having a political stake in the struggle between monotheism and paganism that did not repress knowledge, sexual knowledge in its worship. So this is the point where, as Roger said, the discourse of the master is give birth to the discourse of the master. And you also show us that after Lacan, this ferocious operation of repression is not attributed to God anymore, but to language itself, to the structure. And I think that's why Lacan, for example, in the preliminary question, say that one cannot say anything about his sexual knowledge, about his prostitution, about znunim. One cannot speak about his own sexual practice without being obscene. So the first question I would ask will be the following. What can you say? It's a little bit, I think you can take it, you come back to it in the end of your intervention, but what can we say about God of civilization today? Or about the function of the symbolical language today? I have in mind what Lacan says in the last chapter that we will soon read, 2 months later, yes, that we will read with Eric Laurent very soon. That is that these days, he said it in 1970, it is very difficult to make someone be ashamed. What would you say today when sexual knowledge, znunim in Hebrew, is easily accessible everywhere? God is not ferocious anymore, or maybe can we really say that there is no monotheistic God anymore? Well, this will be my first question. I have 4 more, but that are shorter. But,
Susana, how do you want? Would you like to respond to that?
Yes, bueno,
Okay.
I would like to be able, like the rabbi, to say, I'll call you back, but I can't do it. So I think what is ferocious today is the push to enjoyment, the push to jouissance.
Yeah.
Now, no doubt that the obscenity of the pornography internet and the obscenity of the reality shows changed our culture. You see it in the analysis. Mm-hmm. You see that people, in order to teach, for instance, I had in analysis the principle of a word of psychotic word in Beryakov. And he said that he will show something through a movie to the nurses and the doctors of his ward. And I decided to stop him. And I told him that a reality show won't teach anything, that he has to think what he wants to teach before he shows. It was not a very psychoanalytical intervention, but I had to do it, I thought. Now, that comes together with the fact that nowadays you are ashamed to be ashamed. You are ashamed of wanting to close the door when you go to the bathroom. In the movies, you see people chatting and shitting together. So I don't know what to think, if it is because a lack of God, or because we have the Yazidis think that God has 2 faces, the Yazidis. One face is a good God, and the other one is a bad God. It's one God, but it has 2 faces. Mm-hmm. I think we are now with this face of the God, the face of the God that he is jouissance. This is something that Lacan said in this seminar in page 166 66, excuse me, in English, in which he says, when I say the use of language, I do not mean that we use it. It is language that uses us. Language employs us, and that is how it enjoys. This is why the only chance for the existence of God is that he, with a capital H, enjoys, and he is jouissance. So maybe my answer to you would have to be that we are in a moment in which God is everywhere, the God of jouissance.
So, Gil, before we go to the next question, I think Florencia had something to add. I don't know whether it's on that question. Florencia, do you want to add something or save it for later?
Yes, thank you, Roger. And thank you very much, Susana, for this wonderful reading of this chapter. It's been incredibly teaching. And it made me... Can you hear me okay?
Yes, very good.
Okay. It made me suddenly remember a supervisor I encountered when I first started my practice some 20 years ago. It was in a very big psychiatric hospital, about 1,800 beds. And it was an encounter with the clinic that, as you can imagine, didn't have a lot of veiling. And this supervisor, I brought a case, and it was a man who had converted to several religions throughout his life as a way to build some solution. And when I mentioned something, the supervisor told me, and have you read this? And it was a reference to Judaism. And I said no. And she got very angry and she told me, you cannot work with psychosis in particular and with psychoanalysis in general without studying history of religions. And I never forgot that. And so this is what your presentation evoked for me. Thank you.
It's also been a fine reminder that one can't practice psychoanalysis without studying a bit of Lacan. Gil, did you have another question?
Yes, I have 4 of them. I don't know if I have. The last one is an hypothesis about the effect of truth that Susana found in this chapter, as she told us. The second one is about truth. You said that you found this very nice formula of the ultimate meaning of the idea of the Father, which ultimate meaning, which is truth for Freud. That's what truth for Freud. But there were two nuances, in the definition of truth that you made. The first one was the murder of the father itself as an ahistoric event, which is printed on the flesh, as a letter, and come back later as a truth and as the truth of faith and religion. This was the first. Afterwards, when you spoke about the function of ignorance, you spoke of truth as knowledge about sexuality, which is the opposite of the established knowledge that is not searching for an effect of truth. So you see, it's two nuances. The one is the trauma printed like a letter on the body, and the other one is this sexual knowledge. So here we can see also the connection between the murder and the murder of the father and the sexual knowledge. The two of them are traumatic. The two of them, you cannot tell them. The two of them you cannot tell. It's like they are kind of a hole in the symbolic. They cannot be said, l'indicible, we say in French. Yes? But they can be written, and you have an access to them by effects of truth, and not by established knowledge. So I wondered if it can be related to the definition that Lacan makes of the Midrash. It's an adventure, yes, but this question. But I wonder it can be related to the definition that you mentioned, that it's a way of taking distance from the written by the spoken word. The Midrash would be a way to treat trauma of the signifier printed on the body by taking distance of the letter, for example. Could we say that? This question is also related to what you brought in the end of your intervention, namely the inexistence of sexual relation that Lacan speaks about. Here there's no letter anymore, because precisely if there's no sexual relation, it is because it cannot be written. So this is why I think truth does not have a big credit at the end of the teaching of Lacan, because it cannot say anything about something that is not written, the real. Truth effects are nothing but a make-believe, if we think it like this.
Susana, you will need to unmute yourself now. Thank you.
I agree with you, Gil, and I thank you for having read the paper so thoroughly. That's why it has changed our behavior when interpreting, and that's why we come to a state of the best interpretation is the cut of the session, and the best interpretation is a cry, not a word. Yes, I think that in analysis, we try to let the patient, not bother him, because if we don't bother the analysants, they do a very good work. So we have to try not to bother the analysants and let them try their way of lying about what is written. Lying, or remembering that the truth and the lie are the same, meaning it's a semblant of truth, or a truth that has this variété, this variation. So the important thing is, and that's why I wanted to discuss the Oedipus complex and the flight talks, that if you have your semblant of truth and you impose it on the patient, two things can happen. Or the patient is re-educated and not analyzed, or he goes out like the guy of the flight talks with a perversion. Meaning that yes, we have to acknowledge that truth is a semblant, and to respect the way an analysant invents his own way of reading what is written. And he doesn't have to convince us. That's it.
One point more is that when we speak about the non-existence of sexual relation, we speak about something that is not written. This was my second point. It's maybe there something about what you say about going in a direction that we can only go in the direction of the real, but not more than that.
Yes, but Lacan said that he had a problem with this aphorism, there is no sexual relation, but because he had to bring it through a no. Mm-hmm. And I think this uncomfort of Lacan has to do with what you say. Mm-hmm. We can't but say there is no sexual relation. It's a problem. The problem is language and the body. How do we put together language in the body? That's why we have to take our help from the poets, for instance, or the musicians, in general, from the artists, because they are the people that try best to connect something to the body, something that can be an image, or can be a sound, or can be a word.
Now, my next, if I can continue, Roger.
Gil, before we go into that, could I just ask for some clarification in relation to the previous question? Because on this question of saying that there is no sexual relation, because Susana, you extracted that very intriguing citation from Speaking to Brick Walls from Saint-Anne, which could I ask you to say something about that quotation, clarify something that you took from the session of the 2nd of December 1971, where page 61 you take it from. There is no sexual relation for the beings that speak. And then he goes on to say there's no sexual relations because we speak, and we speak because there is no sexual relation. It's that we speak in the space where something is not written, as we do each time we meet here. But then it goes on to say, the translation, the being speaks. It is only from speech that jouissance proceeds, that which is called sexual jouissance, to be differentiated from the sexual relation. So as far as I'm concerned, the translation is maybe a bit tangled, but there's one question about the relation between speech and the sexual relation. There's another question about the relation between speech and jouissance. But what it seems to amount to is that jouissance is not equivalent to the sexual relation. There's a jouissance of speech, and the sexual relation is something else. So would there be something we can say about the relation between speech and jouissance that happens in the foreclosure of the sexual relation? If you can say something about the quotation more than about my question.
If I can say, I don't understand very good what bothers you. What is that you...
Can I try to formulate it better? Because it's almost as if he's saying that the jouissance that proceeds from speech is the jouissance that is called sexual. But the jouissance that is called sexual has to be differentiated from the sexual relation.
Yes. I think what he says is, I have to bring things from other places, no? That in fact, the sexual jouissance that has to do with the body of another person, which is sexual, because for Lacan, of course, onanism is not sexual. It's the enjoyment in your own body. So sexual jouissance, since it has to do with another body, that you had to make from that body a sexual object, means that you came to the bed with something that you found it and you made for a semblance of sexual relation can be happen in the bed. Meaning that it has to go through the semblance. That's why he once said that making somebody my sexual object means that he fits my fantasy of what is sexual? What is...
Thank you, Susana. It also seems to me that there's a version there that elaborates something that Gil's first question touched on, the idea that sexual knowledge today doesn't go via the other. What Gil was saying about the demonstration of bodies in sexual activity on all corners. So we can, I think, as Gil asked, what happens to the sexual non-relation under these terms, where to some extent we are flooded with demonstration of the enjoyment of bodies, but without having to go via the eroticization of a relation to the other. Gil, you had another question which might be better formulated.
No.
Than mine, not than yours.
I want to go back to anyway. What you mentioned now, it's interesting because, but it's a whole of a theme. I think that we will be able to follow in the next study days of the SAF about attentat sexuel. This question, we try to take this question civilization, the question of civilization into account. But I wanted to come back to the point that you already answered partly about it, but about the case of the fly talks. I think it is very useful what you said about it, and maybe it's worth to develop it a little bit more. I remind only the point that is treated around this case. It's the patient's dream about a man with an armor, yes, moving forwards behind him, armed with a needle of fly talks, yes. And the analyst, with a woman, it's important, I think, in this case, interprets saying that this figure is one of the the one of the phallic mother, which means in the transference that because she is behind him, in a way, because he's on the coach and she is behind, so it means that it is the analyst who is the phallic mother. And Lacan says that the way of bringing the patient to the reality of the situation, to her, in fact, wanting him to put his desire into the right place, because this means it's not me. This means you have to desire elsewhere, yes, in a way. So in response to it, he wants to make love to her. And then he has this transitory voyeurist perversion, yes, to go to see women in the toilets. So I'm repeating a little bit what you said, but I think it's worth to stress that using the Oedipus as a myth that would regulate the life of the analysant, the analyst is pushing the subject to acknowledge his Oedipal desires, and it is an interpretation in the name of the father. In a way, it's an interpretation. Stop to desire in that way. That's in a way. So it's in the name of prohibition. And the subject is revolts, or is revolting, or yes, revolts. So I think also there's a kind of lack of decency or pudeur. I don't know what do you say, pudeur. We don't
Susana,
hear
your microphone. Maybe modesty at that stage, Gil.
Okay.
If we're going to distinguish modesty from shame.
Okay. So there's a lack of shame, of modesty in this interpretation. Too much sexual knowledge resulting by by this acting out? What do you say?
What I say is as follows. I try to stress that when I said the real presence of the analyst, I put it in, how do you say in English? It's not brackets.
In quotes, quotation marks.
Quotes.
In
Why?
quoted comments, yeah.
Because one thing that Lacan is making a joke from Ruth Lebovici is because she understands as if in analysis you have to offer yourself as a real presence, for instance, in this case of the phallic mother, and from there you act and you push the patient to be the right Oedipus, the one that behaves, let's say. Now, Lacan jokes about this real presence because in other places further on in the seminar, in the 6th seminar, and in other seminars, he asks, what is the real presence? The real presence is a phrase from Christendom, where you have in the communion the real presence of the Christ in the bread that you eat, that nowadays is a problem because of the corona. Now, this real presence, in one place, Lacan says, what can we call the real presence? The real presence is presenting the signifier of the impossibility of having a right signifier, which is the phallus as a signifier of signification. In the case of Ruth Lebovici,
you have some real presence, Susana.
Yes, I have a real presence of my partner, yes. In the description she makes, she also says that he was looking at her legs.
Yeah.
And she was very happy about that, because if he looks at her legs, about being a compliment about her legs, is also that is going to be the right patient, meaning the Oedipus. And the problem was that these legs belongs to the president of the association, because she was the wife of Lebovici, but then he was the president of the IPA, and he sent the patient to his wife. It is very funny and very, Lacan doesn't say when he speaks about the flight talks that about the Oedipal complex, but it's the best way that I had to understand which is the problem that Lacan fights against. The problem of the needs regulating life, regulating our work. In the beginning of the seminar, when in the first lesson of this seminar, the 17th, he criticized himself and he says, oh, I am looking for meaning. I am looking for meaning. And he says again, well, that's what we human people do. We look for meaning. And in analysis, a way of having meaning very at hand is the Oedipus complex. But you have to wait to see what is the meaning that the analysand will invent. Yes, I think it's very good to learn this case in all stations.
Thank you, Susana. Gil, I know Vicente had a question. Shall we just, Vicente, if your comment is still live with Vicente Palomero, and then we'll follow up with.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much, Susana, for your reading, your interesting reading of this seminar, this chapter.
Susana, can you mute your mic for the feedback, please?
Yes.
Just going back to the conversation, the dialogue that Gil and you had 5 minutes ago, because there have been lots of things after. And I was wondering if we could reread the title of this chapter, saying that instead of making a certain homology between Yahweh's and the unconscious. I mean, why we could probably say, because Gil said that the sexual relationship that is not written, what is and the dialogue was about what is written and what is not written. This is the thing. This is the subject thing that we are dealing with in this chapter, and I wonder if we could not say that the unconscious, we could call it the ferocity, the unconscious ferocity, in regarding the question that the unconscious does not know that there is no sexual relationship, that the knowledge of the unconscious is a knowledge that, like Yahweh shows us in the myth, Yahweh does not know, ignores that there is no sexual relationship. So we could reread this question of not being written as a definition of what is the unconscious as such, the Freudian unconscious. And I would even say that in this chapter, we see that Lacan starts an operation of eliminating, we could say, the myth of the dead father. By taking a concept from Lévi-Strauss, which is the term of equivalence. Because what is striking in this question of the myth is, I mean, not the Oedipus only, because Lacan says the Oedipus complex is a dream, it's Freud's dream. Then Moses and monotheism is an oddity. It is a strange text. We all agree with this. And totem and taboo, which is the real myth, the Freudian myth, is totem and taboo, which is a myth of the real father. Lacan wants to eliminate the myth of the dead father and replacing it with a question that we could call it, pointing out the equivalence between the dead father and the jouissance of old women, which is at stake in this question, in this seminar. So the point of the myth that is going to stay in Lacan's teaching, that is going to remain in his teaching at the level of this dead father, is an equivalence between two things that are nothing, that have nothing to do: the death of the father and the question of all the women, that all the women doesn't exist, that the jouissance of all the women is exactly, it is something that does not exist. And I think that this is going to be developed by Lacan in the following seminars, especially in the seminar d'un discours qui ne serait du semblant, of a discourse that wouldn't be
semblant.
No, and that was something that I thought when listening the question that Gil asked Susana, the question about what is not written. So we could say that the ignorance of the unconscious, that the unconscious ignores that there is no sexual relationship, and that it always repeats a knowledge which, not knowing that there is no such a thing that a sexual relationship. Would you agree with me?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I shall go to the beginning of your path because you made a very long travel, which I find it very good one and very teaching, this intervention of yours. But I would like to do something with the beginning. When you said, you proposed that we could take the word Yehovah and put the unconscious there, I remembered my beginning of studying Lacan with Masota, because he was in Buenos Aires then. Before he loved you, he loved us, the porteños. Now, what we find is in the unconscious, Freud says you can't know that there is a vagina in the analysis, because what exists in the unconscious is the phallus, because of the universal theory of the phallus, meaning our psychic apparatus is built on a delirium according to which everything has a phallus. And from that point of view, yes, the unconscious is ignorant of the fact that there are animals that are men and animals that are women, because there is only one signifier, which is the phallus. Now, when in Saint-Thome, Lacan says that there is no equivalence, because I didn't mention that because the place I chose for the quote doesn't say it, but what we can understand from Saint-Thome is that when a person is not in the discourse, is not part of this delirium of the universality of the phallus, there is no equivalence in the unconscious between the woman and the man. So there is sexual relation, because when do we have sexual relation? When the two parts that participate in the act are different, are completely different. Which means that there is no equivalence. That's why he says in psychosis there is no equivalence, therefore there is sexual relation. Whereas in the regular people, in the neurotics, in the unconscious, there is an ignorance of the fact that we are built differently, women and men. We don't know what is this difference. We can't say it because it's a real that can't be said. We can only invent, make beliefs of what is a woman and what is a man. But you said many things that we could make a seminar about what you said in your intervention.
Was not my intention. Just proposing that if there is no, if the sexual relationship is not written, as Gil pointed out, then why not translating this Yahweh's ignorance as saying that talking about the ignorance of the unconscious? That's just the point, because the unconscious is a knowledge that works always saying the same thing. That is to say, not knowing that there is no sexual relationship, which is not written. Just this.
Thank you, Vicente. Each time we open this terrain, we see, yes, we could elaborate a whole seminar around some of these questions. Just a brief comment on that question of equivalence, because I think it's something that struck me in your elaboration, and it also goes back to a version of Gil's initial question about the contemporary civilization, because to some extent, aren't we faced with a civilization of equivalence? The very democratic principle is each one equivalent, and the whole question, shall we say, of the whatever we call it under the guise of feminism, is equivalence for all. And we can see, in the name of the most liberal principles of upholding democracy, we unleash a principle of equivalence that puts in question everything that's played out around the non-rapport. How we trace out those questions at a social and political level would again be a question, shall we say, for another seminar. we don't have unlimited time today, as always. I know that Rick had flagged up a question, and I know that Gil probably has another question in store. Let's see how that goes, and then we'll see what's left. Okay, Rick.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Hello? Yeah?
I can hear you, Rick.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, Susana, a fantastic talk, and as Ferencia was saying, extremely teaching. I will keep my question very short because we're running out of time. I'm very aware of that. But when you were talking and when Gil was talking, and Vicente also referred to it, the dynamic between what is written and what is not written. What struck me is that obviously the Torah is about it's a written text. And whether in some ways in how the Jewish people read the Torah, there is that dynamic between the written and what is not written. In other words, a reading towards the real. And so my question, to be brief here, is there something about the Torah that functions like a symptom for the Jewish people? In other words, a reading toward the letter, towards the traces on the body and so on. That's my question.
Excellent question, Rick. Thank you. Susana or Gil, you want to say something about that?
Well, being Jewish doesn't make me able to answer to that. I think the idea you had that the Torah is the sanctum for a Jewish person, if he is religious, I like the idea you have. Yes, could be, because the Torah and the Halacha, all the laws, they function as a sanctum, meaning that this is the way the religious Jews suffer and enjoy. Why did they decide? I once asked this great rabbi, which is the brother of my partner, I have to say. I asked him, why did they decide in the Talmud that it would have been better not to have been born? How can that be? When I know that suicide is forbidden and your body is not yours, it has been lent to you. He told me that, well, because being alive, having your life, having been born, comes together with a lot of suffering, with a lot of obligations you have towards God. So, and is also a way of living in community. Now, this could be a symptom if we say the symptom is the symptom in the moment in which it has become social level. Yes, the religion is a kind of symptom because makes you suffer, makes you enjoy, connects you to the community, is a perfect symptom. And it tells you when you can sleep with your husband, when you can't. In this moment, yes, from this way is a kind of regulation. In fact, the symptom is a kind of regulation of life. A regulation that you invented, and you invited also.
Thank you very much, Susana.
Although, Rick, at the heart of your question, the notion of the sanctum as a reading of what has not been written, I think is a very fine formulation and goes absolutely to the heart of the matter, which is also intrinsic to the approach, shall we say, of Selin to reading in the scripture what has not been written and then constructing what he wants it to say. Gil, shall we give you something approaching the last word?
Maybe yes.
As a work, you showed me a work of yours, Gil, in which you study perfectly this work that Celine has made in Kako on the Torah with the letters. It was very interesting for me to read it.
Yeah, it's an old story. Yes, 30 years ago I wrote it. Yeah. It's in Les Feuillets du Courtil, number 11. You can find it, yeah. But I had two questions now. We don't have time. I'll tell the two of them in a shortened way, and you will choose maybe the one you want to respond to. The first one was about I took again this question of equivalency and the woman as a symptom of the man is the ravage of the woman. But afterwards, because I asked about what you say about the substitution of prohibition for impossibility is incomplete, because we are used to think that in analysis this substitution is obtained. We can do this substitution between prohibition and impossibility yes, and impossibility.
Well, that's my question, because why did I bring, there was a discussion about prohibition some weeks ago in this web seminar, and that made me find this place in Lacan. I find that Lacan himself had to explain to himself why the idea of prohibition stays, even though we know logically that the problem is the impossibility. But nevertheless, in our thoughts, the thought has to orient themselves with the idea of prohibition. One thing that maybe is connected to this, I'm not sure, I have to think about it, is that he mentions in the seminar, the seventh seminar on the ethics, that in the 10 Commandments, it doesn't say that it's prohibited to sleep with your mother. It doesn't say. And he said, saying that you have to honor your father and your mother doesn't count as saying you don't have to sleep with her. Mm-hmm. And he answers to this oddity by saying that this incest of a man with his mother would be the impossibility of speech, the possibility of demand. Meaning that I think that up to the end, he thinks that there is a prohibition that falls on the enjoyment of your body and the enjoyment of the place for where your body comes, which is the body of your mother. And I think that we can't get rid of that in our thoughts. It's true though that in analysis the understanding of the impossibility gives you a lot of freedom. Mm-hmm. That precisely, yeah. Because knowing that there is something impossible gives you freedom. But it means also that in analysis you accept impotence. You accept impotence as the human condition in front of the impossibility. And Miller has a very nice comment when he presents the Je parle mieux, and he says something, I don't remember exactly the words, but he says that psychoanalysis makes us friends with impotence. At least the impotence respects the real. Impotence respects the real. So in analysis, we come to be friends with our impotence and with the impossibility.
This is very interesting, yes. We could, this case of my analysis with Freud of Gardiner, and there's a little story there of someone who is in analysis, and he becomes impotent during analysis, at the end of analysis, and he comes to complaints to complain in Freud's seeing Freud. I finished my analysis and I'm impotent. And Freud listened to him 45 minutes, and then he follow him. He goes into the door and tell him, "Now I see that you are somebody, a good guy. That you are a good guy now." Yeah. Oh, we don't hear you. We don't hear you.
There was a story between women because he came to Wien.
Yes.
The mistress.
Yes.
And he was impotent with the mistress or something like this, or with the wife. I don't remember which of them.
Yes, I think it means that now that you are impotent with your wife, that you are not infidel. How do you say? You're not faithful for now that you can be impotent with the woman you are not faithful to. You are somebody. You are a good man, good guy, something like that.
It was a Lacanian intervention of Freud.
Yeah.
That's excellent. I thank you all so much. We arrive at the point that Susana mentioned of something that can't be got rid of, but also something which remains to be said at the point where something never ceases to not right itself. I thank Susana in particular, Gil for his assistance, all of you for this demonstration, shall we say, of the power of speech and multiple voices in conversation in working this terrain, and especially Susana at the last, and Gil for opening up not just that furrow that takes us from impotence to impossibility, but maybe also opens up some echoes in the elithosphere for next week's presentation by Geert Hurnet and Veronique Verroes. We look forward to seeing you all again next week. Thank you once again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. It was very good.